Now, this is a topic that I've discussed on several occasions, and that's how people fall into cult mentality when they join a spiritual community. And there's a real danger there. And of course, there are red flags and signs to look out for. But one could ask, was the Buddha essentially trying to establish a cult? Because on the outside anyway, then there are many aspects of any religion that seem to resemble cult activity. Now, one of these is this, what is called Phobia Programming. And that's where you give someone a sort of threat or fear that would endanger their life or their security, and use this as a means of controlling people. For example, Donald Trump goes on that you need to elect him because otherwise the country will be overrun by cannibalistic migrants from the southern border. This sort of thing. Hitler used it by demonizing the Jews. And so in most religions, they talk about the existence of a place called hell, and that if you don't behave yourself, then you're going to be born in hell. Now, where there would be a red flag, where there would be a danger of someone falling into a cult, would be if that religion or that leader were to teach you that unless you listen to what I say, unless you follow me as the ultimate authority, then you're going to hell. And that's not what the Buddha taught. Because what the Buddha taught was, it's up to the individual whether they experience happiness or suffering. So as you can see here, then the Buddha wasn't saying, well, you have to follow me, you have to listen to me, otherwise you will end up in hell. I think there's three things that people in cults are conditioned to, and that's if anybody attacks the leader, or the doctrine or the policies of that religion, then they're going to suffer for that. And whereas the Buddha didn't teach this, the Buddha taught famously, you are your own protector. You are your own worst enemy. It is based on your actions, excellent and inferior, that you become your own witness. By this, the Buddha was teaching that it was all up to you. Famously, the Buddha said, I can only teach you the path to awakening, but you yourself alone must tread that path. Now, this is really important. But there are kind of Buddhist manifestations that appear as cults these days. I suppose they've always existed. One is called the New Kadampas. They're not really Buddhists. And in that tradition, then they teach you have to just listen to their leader. He's dead now. But, you're not allowed to read any other books. You're not allowed to criticize their leader. And they're also very anti-Dalai Lama. And they spread a lot of disinformation about the Dalai Lama. And they basically teach their followers that they're going to go to hell unless they listen to their particular teacher, this Geshe. So, of course, any religion can be manipulated into a cult framework. But certainly what the Buddha was teaching didn't seem to have this aspect, because the Buddha was saying it was up to you. And it's your actions that will shape your future experiences. So another thing we understand is that people who get indoctrinated into cults become brainwashed. And what they say is that brainwashing is a dissociative disorder. It's a disruption of identity. So somebody's identity gets removed and replaced by something else. And so when you look at the Buddhist teachings, you could think that this was a form of brainwashing, because the Buddha taught that there is no self. And so often people get afraid when they hear this teaching. They think like somebody's trying to erase their identity. But what you have to understand is that through brainwashing and indoctrination into a cult, then that individual's identity is kind of moved aside and replaced by another identity. It's not completely gone, because underneath that remains their sort of memories of their past and who they associated with in the past are still there, but it gets superseded by another identity. And so why would it be that the Buddhist teachings aren't doing this? And that's because the Buddha taught that there is no self, and the meaning of no self is that there is no fixed identity. And so what the Buddha taught is that we have to avoid the strong identification with good or bad. For example, in a cult, then you have to see the leader as being supreme and the doctrine as being unshakable. But the Buddha didn't teach this. The Buddha taught that you need to question things. So famously, and I've said this before, the Buddha taught that you should not accept what I say out of mere reverence or veneration. Instead, you should test it, the way that a goldsmith tests gold, by rubbing, burning, and cutting it to see if it's authentic. So you can see here the Buddha wasn't saying you have to listen to what I say and follow what I say, otherwise you're going to hell. The Buddha was saying you need to think for yourself, and that's really important. And so it's very different from what is taught in a cult situation. In a cult situation, people are slowly indoctrinated by the pressure of the group. We've got this strong kind of survival instinct where we need to follow along. We've got this herd mentality. And what happens is people arrive at the temple, everybody is like doing something, and they want to kind of fit in. And eventually what happens is that you become afraid of speaking out or thinking for yourself or asking questions, because if you do, then you suddenly become kind of like the enemy within, and they will turn on you. But this certainly happens in cult situations and happens in some Buddhist communities, but it wasn't what the Buddha was teaching, because the Buddha was saying that you need to think for yourself, you need to think critically. And it always kind of surprised me, because these days in America, many of these sort of MAGA followers think that critical thinking is something very negative, and they lash out at this. To me, it really is a sign of this kind of cult mentality, where you just have to accept what you're being taught. But that's not what the Buddha taught, and that's not the meaning of no self. The meaning of no self isn't that we're trying to erase who you are. What we're trying to say is that your clinging to a fixed identity is a cause of suffering. For example, if I think, well, I'm a man, and men do this and they don't do that, and then somehow I contravene my identity, it will cause me to suffer. For example, many young people have a kind of gender confusion when they reach puberty. It's got to do with their changing hormones, etc. And so at some point, I think many men have had kind of homosexual experiences. They may not have had actual sexual experiences with somebody of their own gender, but they may have sort of, for example, fancied somebody who is a man, if you're a man. And this can cause people a lot of trouble. They feel like they have to repress these feelings because they go against their male identity. And this can cause them to suffer quite a lot. And there are many examples of this. For instance, we have national identity. And if we feel that we contravene this national identity, that as well can cause us to suffer. But the difference between what the Buddha taught and what is taught in cults is, in the cult, then you have to adopt a very particular type of identity. This Dr. Hassan, who teaches a lot about cults, he said that the way that you should approach people who are in cults is through compassion. You should see them as being human beings and not to objectivize them. For example, objectivize them as if they were some kind of MAGA follower and anything they say is wrong. That's not the way to approach it. What he says is that you have to see them as a human being and sort of sincerely ask them about their experiences. And this will help them to reconnect with their original self or their old self before they got reprogrammed. And so again, as I said earlier, then there's this kind of aspect of being in a cult, and that is that you must never question the leader, you must never question the doctrine, and you must never question the policies of that tradition. And so this is the case in many religious organizations. I experienced this myself on a very low level when I was young, because I had many questions about Christianity. Of course, I was born in a Christian nation, in a Christian community, and I was taught that I should identify as a Christian. But when I went to the church, then I had many questions about what was being taught. And as I said before, then I asked the Sunday school teacher, and she ostracized me for this. She told me to shut up and kicked me out of the Sunday school because I was asking questions. For me, this was a red flag when I was a young child, and eventually it was one of the reasons why I completely abandoned Christianity. But this isn't a fault of Christianity itself, because Jesus' teachings are authentic. There is nothing wrong with teaching love and compassion and tolerance. The problem lies within the institutions. As we know, in recent times, there have been many cases of controlling and abusive behavior within the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. But this arises from the negativity that is inherent in the institution itself. It is not a problem with the Buddhist tradition as a whole. And how do we know that? Well, in Buddhism, we're taught to study other religions. It's seen to be very important. We're taught to study other religions so that we can come to clearly understand what their philosophical position is. And not only that, but part of the process of education in the Buddha Dharma is to debate different philosophical views. For example, we might argue for the position of a theistic religion like Christianity. And in this way, then we probe the faults in our own understanding and clarify our understanding. And what you find from engaging in this kind of debate is that no one system of philosophy is perfect. In fact, there are many faults. And even within Buddhism itself, then there are different presentations. For example, in the Vaibhashika and the Sautantrikas, then they teach that outer phenomena are composed of real quantum particles, and that these particles are substantial. But in the Chittamatra and upwards, then they teach that there are no substantial particles, or they're not fixed in any way. So there's big differences there. And through this process of studying dialectics and epistemology, what one finds is that no single linguistic system is able to express the ultimate truth clearly. And so realizing that there is no perfect theology or doctrine, one does not cling to these things. Also, it's seen to be a fault to criticize other religions in the Buddha Dharma. And so as you see here, it's very different from what goes on in a cult environment. But of course, what can happen for any religion is it can be abused. And usually where we go wrong, and what happens is that you've got a teacher who is at the head of a particular lineage. So if they themselves, through their practice, haven't conquered their greed and anger, jealousy, pride, they are always susceptible to being corrupted by their own kleshas or negative emotions. In the past, it was a different situation because people practiced until they gave rise to realization. And it was only then that these individuals would go out and teach. So they'd spend most of their time in the wilderness like a wild animal. And for example, if you look at Milarepa, then he didn't have many followers. And if people showed up, he would run away because he was afraid of these things. In the text, it's taught there's two types of tolerance. There's the tolerance for the negative obstacles that arise when you're trying to practice. For example, needing to find food or clothing, that sort of thing. But what is taught to be more difficult is to tolerate the good things, the positive stuff. And what is taught to be the positive stuff is the praise and adoration of others, and also the gifts that they give you. And so if you haven't conquered your own inner emotions, and then you receive lots of praise and gifts from others, then there's a chance that you will become corrupted. And in fact, this is almost inevitable. This is what happens. This is what happens to all the oligarchs and billionaires these days. Because they're basically human beings with all kinds of normal human faults, and then they become extremely powerful. And once one becomes powerful and rich, one starts giving rise to all kinds of funny ideas. Rich and powerful men often use their position of influence to take advantage of vulnerable women. But this doesn't only happen in business circles, it also happens in religious institutions. There have been many cases recently of Christian youth pastors being sent to jail for taking advantage of their students. As I said before, I've said this many times, that as long as we are still afflicted by our negative emotions, then there's the chance that we'll be radicalized by our own greed and anger, jealousy, pride, etc. And so our principal task is to conquer our negative emotions, to avoid all non-virtue or negativity. And then after that, what we need to do is apply ourselves to virtue. And primarily virtue is those acts that are motivated by altruism, love, and compassion. And finally, our task is to control or thoroughly tame our mind. And the process of thoroughly taming one's mind is not just to rely on doctrine, is just to follow blindly in what is being taught. The process of thoroughly taming one's mind is for oneself to come to understand the true nature of reality, and by that be able to rest in authentic equipoise or meditation. But this is another topic, and one that is quite profound, and that can't be covered in a short period of time. Now, I noticed something recently on the channel, and that is that many people who watch these videos are not subscribed. And I don't usually ask for your subscription, but recently there was a video that got over 250,000 views. And of course, the channel only has 16,000 subscribers. So potentially there is a larger audience that we could reach. And it's really up to you whether you decide to subscribe or not. But it might be the case that you've just forgotten to do it. So if you're watching this content and you enjoy it, then I encourage you to subscribe because it will help this message spread to more people. And the reason why I want to spread this message is not because I want to become famous or rich. It's because I believe that what the Buddha taught is something positive, and that this message will help others to find peace and tranquility, and also to overcome their suffering in the mundane world. Because it is my sincere wish that you should progress swiftly on the spiritual path, and by that achieve liberation from the mundane world, and eventually to achieve final awakening, which is an inconceivable state of profound peace and tranquility, inexpressible through linguistics, and inaccessible through conceptual thinking. And in order to achieve those ends, then I'm willing to do whatever I can, and put in the effort to make these kind of videos. But what you should know is that basically, I don't make any profit from this. In fact, I lose money, but that's okay, I don't mind, because I'm not in it for the money. So what I'm doing at the moment is setting up a not-for-profit society. And that's so any money that is raised through this platform or through social media can be directed to support those who want to dedicate themselves to their practice. And that everything will be transparent and accountable. And so there will be no doubt as to whether or not I'm using the money to enrich myself. Really, I want it to be something that will be beneficial. So next week, I'm going to be traveling to Korea with my father. He's getting quite old now, and it might be his last chance. He's going to visit the parents' grave. And when I'm there, then I'll have the opportunity to interview a Zen master from Sudoksa Temple. And also I'll go around visiting some of the other temples on pilgrimage and post a few videos. So if you can, look out for that. And so what I'm saying is there'll be some disruption in my usual schedule for uploading videos, but at the same time there'll be something interesting, a bit of a travelogue, a kind of Buddhist travelogue abroad. I hope you will be able to join me on that journey. So anyway, until next time, then see you later.